Ever get completely thrown by, like, a medical mystery? You know those stories where somebody's sick, like really sick, but doctors just can't crack the code?
It's like a real-life detective story.
Totally. And that's exactly what we're diving into today, a real medical enigma and the unlikely culprit, Mercury.
Oh, Mercury.
Yeah, we're talking about a surprisingly common yet often missed health hazard.
Right, right.
So to guide us through this, we're using this book, Diagnosis Mercury, by Dr. Jane Hightower.
Okay.
And get this, she's a doctor who stumbled upon a kind of a shocking number of mercury poisoning cases right there in her own practice.
Wow.
Yeah, so we're going to follow her journey as she uncovers this hidden epidemic.
It really makes you think twice about what we consider safe in our everyday lives, you know?
Absolutely. Okay, so it all starts with one of Dr. Hightower's patients. We'll call her Toshiko. Successful businesswoman, travels all the time, frequently between the U.S. and Japan. Seems perfectly healthy, right?
Right.
Then, bam, she starts experiencing these really strange fainting spells.
Fainting?
Yeah, like imagine fainting on a plane.
Oh, that's scary.
Yeah, super concerning, especially for someone with no history of that kind of thing.
Exactly.
But it doesn't stop there. Toshiko also starts experiencing these waves of nausea, terrible stomach problems, constant fatigue, even hair loss, and trouble concentrating. Can you imagine?
And to make matters worse, she's probably seen specialist after specialist, gone through countless tests.
Oh, I'm sure, tons of them. And the worst part?
No answers.
Nothing. They can't figure it out.
It's a nightmare scenario, really. I mean, a lot of people listening have probably experienced at least one of those symptoms.
Oh, for sure.
So it's relatable, but it also highlights why diagnosing mercury poisoning can be so difficult.
Because it looks like so many other things.
Exactly.
So Toshiko is understandably at her wit's end. And that's where Dr. Hightower steps in. Through a series of questions, really insightful questions, she starts to suspect this unlikely cause. Mercury.
Mercury poisoning. So we're talking about heavy metal poisoning. How does somebody like that, a busy professional, get exposed to mercury?
That is the million-dollar question, and that's what's so fascinating about this.
Okay, so how?
Well, let's bring in another one of Dr. Hightower's patients. We'll call her Amy. Amy's case is like a mirror image of Toshiko's same symptoms, the fatigue, the brain fog, stomach issues, the whole 9 yards. But there's this one striking detail. Amy constantly feels like she has a hangover.
A hangover?
Yeah, but she doesn't drink alcohol.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, talk about debilitating. You're constantly feeling that way.
It just drags you down.
Exactly. Impacted your whole life. And just like Toshiko, she spent a fortune trying to get answers, seeing doctors, doing tests, nothing, no diagnosis.
It's just awful.
So with Amy, Dr. Hightower asks this really pivotal question. It's a real turning point in this whole Mercury saga. She asks her, do you eat fish?
Do you eat fish?
Okay, but why is that so important?
Well, before I answer that, let me ask you, why do you think that seemingly simple question was so crucial? Well, certain types of fish, especially the bigger ones, they can build up a lot of mercury in their bodies, right?
Yeah, it's called bioaccumulation.
Right, bioaccumulation. That's where the mercury levels increase as you go higher up the food chain.
So a small fish might have a little bit of mercury, but a bigger fish, like a tuna, eats tons of those smaller fish.
Ends up with a much higher concentration.
Exactly. It's like this game of toxic concentration going from like plankton to shrimp to tuna. Each step accumulates more and more mercury. So last time we were talking about this possible link between mystery symptoms and seafood. It all comes down to this like really basic question. Do you eat fish?
And in both Toshiko and Amy's cases, the answer was a big fat yes. They both loved fish.
This was back in 2000, right?
Right, 2000.
Like before people were really talking about mercury in seafood.
Exactly. Back then, fish was like the poster child for healthy eating. Good fats, nutrients, all that.
Nobody was really thinking about the potential downsides.
Right.
So Dr. Hightower, she's got this hunch about mercury, decides to test both Toshiko and Amy's blood mercury levels. And what she finds is, it was pretty shocking.
What did she find?
Both women, sky-high mercury levels, way above what was considered safe.
Oh, wow. But she had a suspicion that might be the case. Right?
True. It wasn't totally out of left field. But, and this is where it gets even more kind of messy, she goes back to her medical textbooks.
Right.
To look at safe mercury levels. And the recommendations she finds there, they're completely different from what the EPA says. Like, the textbooks suggest a much higher threshold for concern.
Wait, so you're telling me the medical community and like the environmental folks, They weren't on the same page about this.
Nope, not at all. And that's a huge deal, right?
It's a massive discrepancy.
Exactly. So the textbook at that time said anything below 50 micrograms per liter of mercury in the blood was okay.
Okay.
The EPA, they recommended a way lower threshold, like 5 micrograms per liter for most people, and even lower for pregnant women and kids.
Wow. We're talking about a 10-fold difference. How can that be? Were they even measuring the same thing?
They were measuring the same thing. The difference was how they looked at risk.
Okay.
The EPA, they're focused on the environment, right? Long-term health.
Mm-hmm.
So they take a way more cautious approach, like even small exposures to mercury over time could be bad. They also factor in that not everyone reacts to things the same way.
Right. Some people are more sensitive than others.
Especially kids. Babies still in the womb. Their bodies are still developing, so they're way more vulnerable.
It's about the big picture. Thinking long-term.
Precisely. And this isn't just some, abstract debate. This has real consequences. You know?
Totally.
Like, imagine a pregnant woman loves sushi. Her doctor, using those older guidelines, might not even think twice about it.
But the EPA, with those stricter standards...
Totally different story. They'd probably advise her to, really limit certain types of fish.
Right.
So it's a classic example of how these guidelines, they might seem kind of technical, but they can have a huge impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. It can literally be the difference between a healthy pregnancy and one with complications.
And this kind of tension, different standards, different ways of looking at risk, it's a theme that runs throughout this whole mercury story.
It's everywhere.
It is. So we have Dr. Hightower kind of stuck in the middle, right?
Yeah.
She sees these conflicting guidelines. The medical community is not really ready to hit the panic button on mercury. What does she do?
What does she do?
She does not back down. Not at all. There's this one event, though, that really pushes her further down this path. Remember the beached whales?
Beached whales.
So she's thinking about her patients, right? Sees this potential connection, calls up a vet who specializes in marine mammals and asks, hey, are you testing these whales for mercury? And the vet's response is, chilling. Super casual. He says, yeah, it's these predatory whales. They often have crazy high mercury levels, but, they tolerate it really well.
They tolerate it really well.
Tolerate it. The whales are beached.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like tolerating.
Exactly. And that just struck her.
Yeah.
What do we consider normal? What are we willing to accept? Especially with these toxins that build up over time.
It makes you think, are we missing something when it comes to our own health? What are we just accepting as normal that really isn't?
Right. It's like this underlying damage that we're not even seeing.
Exactly.
So that encounter, plus the conflicting guidelines, plus her patients, Dr. Hightower's like, okay, I need to get to the bottom of this.
She's on a mission now.
Big time. And because there's not a lot of clear medical guidance, she decides to take matters into her own hands. She starts doing this, informal survey of her patients.
She becomes a detective.
Total detective. So she's asking about their fish consumption, right?
What kind of fish do they eat?
Exactly. How often? And she keeps tracking their mercury levels over time. What she finds is pretty revealing.
What does she find?
She finds a direct link between the types of fish people are eating and their mercury levels. So people who regularly eat those big fish like tuna, swordfish, shark, their mercury levels were way higher than people who mainly ate smaller fish, the ones lower on the food chain.
So it's not just about being a vegetarian or not. It's about being a discerning fish eater.
Exactly. It's about knowing what you're eating. And it gets even more interesting. She starts advising her patients, hey, cut back on fish, especially those high mercury types, for 6 months, and let's see what happens.
6 months. Okay. So she has her theory, she's gathering data, and now she's intervening.
Trying to make a real difference. So the big question is, does it work? Does simply avoiding certain types of fish actually move the needle on those mercury levels?
That is the million-dollar question.
So did it work? Did cutting back on certain types of fish actually make a difference in Dr. Hightower's patients?
Okay, so get this. After just 6 months, most of her patients, their mercury levels plummeted, significantly, often falling below that crucial EPA threshold, that 5 micrograms per liter we talked about.
Wow, that's incredible, just from changing their diet. But what about how they felt? I mean, that's what matters.
Oh, absolutely, and that's the most amazing part. Many patients, they reported feeling so much better. Those vague but really annoying symptoms they'd been dealing with, the fatigue, the brain fog, the stomach problems, they started to disappear.
It's like this light bulb moment, right? They could cut back on the mercury and things literally clear up.
Yeah, exactly.
But, okay, this is bigger than just one doctor and her patients, right? What happens next?
Word spreads like wildfire, right? Dr. Hightower's findings, even though, it's from this informal study, people start paying attention, especially with all the buzz about environmental toxins. And then she gets a call from 2020.
No way. 2020?
2020.
Talk about a platform.
Huge. They want to do a whole segment on her work.
Wow, so suddenly she's thrust into the national spotlight. How does she handle that?
Carefully, she's very aware of the responsibility, agrees to the interview, but insists on protecting her patients, obviously. Wants to make sure their stories are told sensitively, no HIPAA violations or anything.
Good for her.
Yeah.
It's so important to find that balance. Raise awareness, but not at the expense of people who are already going through a lot.
Absolutely.
So the 2020 segment airs. What happens?
It's like a bomb went off. Suddenly, mercury in seafood is all over the news, and people are listening. Grocery stores. They can't keep tuna on the shelves. It was crazy.
Well, talk about the power of media. A good story told well can really shift the conversation.
For sure.
But what about the FDA, the EPA? How do they respond to all of this?
Well, the FDA, maybe they felt the pressure, but they finally issued new guidelines on fish consumption, acknowledged the mercury risks, especially for pregnant women and little kids, recommended limiting certain types of fish, particularly those higher up on the food chain.
Okay, so a step in the right direction. But it makes you wonder, why did it take so long? Why did it take this big media moment to get some action?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And, it's complicated. But Dr. Hightower, she hints at how powerful industries can be. Politics, even scientists can be resistant to new ideas. It can take a long time to turn research into actual change.
It's a good reminder that science doesn't exist in a vacuum. Real world's messy. Okay, back to mercury. We've talked about it in our environment, in our food. But there's this whole other layer to the story. Mercury in medicine. Can you believe that?
I know, right? Sounds crazy now. But for centuries, mercury was considered this miracle cure. People used it for everything. Syphilis, constipation, even teething pain in babies.
Teething pain? Mercury? I mean, I know we know better now, but still.
Wild, right. But back then, people didn't really understand how toxic mercury was. They just knew, hey, this seems to work. Let's use it for everything.
Not the best logic.
Not at all.
So what happened? What were some of the consequences of all this mercury?
Oh, man, some really sad stories. There was this thing called pink disease. Babies, little kids, they'd get exposed to mercury, often from those teething powders. It was awful. They'd have tremors, rashes, sometimes paralysis, just devastating.
Heartbreaking, and all because people didn't know any better.
It's a reminder to always be questioning, always be learning, right? What we think is safe today, maybe in 50 years, we'll look back and be horrified.
Totally. We're always learning. So that's kind of the backdrop for this whole debate about mercury and vaccines, right?
Exactly. It's all connected. People hear mercury and they get understandably freaked out.
Rightfully so. It's a scary word.
But here's the thing. It's super important to remember, not all mercury is created equal. The type that was used in some vaccines, it's called ethyl mercury. It's different.
Different how?
Well, your body processes it way differently than methyl mercury, which is what's in fish. Ethyl mercury, it's broken down quickly, eliminated, doesn't stick around and build up in your tissues the way methyl mercury does.
Okay, so different types, different risks.
Exactly. And that's the key takeaway here. Knowledge is power. The more we understand the science, the different types of mercury, the risks, the research, then we can make informed decisions for ourselves and our families.
I'm all about informed decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So we covered a lot of ground today. We talked about mercury in our environment, in our food, in medicine, in vaccines.
It's everywhere.
It is. So for our listeners who are maybe feeling a little overwhelmed, what's the one thing we want them to take away from this deep dive?
That even small amounts of mercury can add up, especially the kind we're getting from some fish.
Right. It's all about those choices we make every day, what we put on our plates, the products we use, even the medications we take.
And it's about staying informed.
Absolutely. Keeping ourselves educated about what's going into our bodies and into our environment. And sometimes making difference can be as simple as choosing the salmon over the swordfish.
There you go.
Love that. Okay, this has been The Deep Dive, taking you deeper into the topics that matter. We'll see you next time.